On the afternoon of September 5, 1949, more than 72,000 spectators packed the edges of Cleveland Municipal Airport. They had come to see speed, raw, mechanical speed, at the height of America's post-war air racing obsession. The roar of piston engines rolled across the concrete, echoing off hangars and nearby neighborhoods. Above it all tore a radically modified P-51 Mustang named Begjin, slicing through the air at over 400 miles per hour. At the controls was Bill Odom, a man who had already written his name into aviation history. Odom was not a rookie. He was one of the most famous aviators in the world, a long-distance record holder who had flown around the globe in just 73 hours and 5 minutes. Legendary aviatrix Jackie Cochran, herself the holder of more speed and altitude records than any woman alive, had personally purchased Begjin for him. She believed he could win the Thompson Trophy, the most dangerous pylon race in America. But there was one problem. Bill Odom had never flown a pylon race before. The airplane itself was a marvel. Begjin barely resembled the war machine that had once escorted bombers over Germany. Its radiator had been moved from the belly to the wingtips to reduce drag. The fuselage had been smoothed and faired until it looked sculpted rather than built. It was no longer a fighter, it was a missile with a cockpit. On the second lap, everything went wrong. Odom cut too close to pylon 3, realized his mistake, and tried to correct toward pylon 4. The Mustang rolled inverted. For a frozen, horrifying moment, it flew upside down, low, fast, and out of control. Then it dropped. Begjin plunged into a house on West Street in Berea, Ohio. The explosion and fireball were immediate. Bill Odom was killed instantly. Inside the house, Jean Lear and her 13-month-old son, Craig, also died. The family had moved into that home just 4 days earlier. 72,000 people watched in stunned silence. The race continued. Cook Cleland, flying a Goodyear F2G Super Corsair, went on to win the Thompson Trophy. When reporters asked him about the crash, his response was blunt and unforgiving. Odom, he said, should never have been in that race. He was a Bendix pilot, a cross-country flyer. Pylon racing demanded a different temperament. Odom was skilled, but he was in the wrong cockpit, at the wrong time, in the wrong race. That single crash ended the golden age of Cleveland air racing. It forced the P-51 Mustang out of the spotlight for more than a decade. Residential neighborhoods were no longer considered acceptable backdrops for high-speed air races. Sponsors pulled out. Regulators stepped in. To many, it looked like the end of the Mustang story. They were wrong. Because while the Mustang's racing career had just collapsed in flames, its second life, a far stranger, darker, and more violent chapter, was only just beginning. When World War II ended in August 1945, the United States military faced a problem no one had planned for. There were too many airplanes. North American aviation had built over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs during the war. At peak production, the factory in Inglewood, California, was turning out more than 100 aircraft per week. Now the assembly lines were silent. Thousands of fighters sat idle in storage depots across North America, Europe, and the Pacific. They were expensive to maintain. Spare parts, preservation, inspections, it all cost more than the aircraft were worth. The solution was brutal. Across the United States and Europe, crews began destroying perfectly good combat aircraft. Acetylene torches cut fuselages in half. Cranes dropped 18-foot steel plates onto wings and cockpits, smashing them like toys. Bombers that had survived flak over Germany were reduced to scrap metal in minutes. At Cal Aero Field near Chino, California, a teenage high school senior named Ed Maloney watched it happen. Maloney loved airplanes. While other kids traded baseball cards, he clipped photos of fighters and built wooden models. Now he stood helplessly as B-17s and B-24s, machines that had carried men into hell and back, were snapped apart and burned. It was almost sickening, he would later say. One day, Maloney saw huge piles of technical manuals, the blueprints, maintenance guides, and combat documents of the war, being set on fire. A worker told him he could take as many as he wanted. Maloney made trip after trip, loading his car with documents, saving what he could from the flames. That moment changed his life forever. He made a vow he would save as many airplanes as possible. But Maloney was the exception. Most Americans saw surplus fighters as nothing more than scrap metal. At government auctions, war-weary P-51 Mustang sold for as little as $1,500, less than the price of a new car. During the war, each Mustang had cost taxpayers about $51,000. Some foreign governments got them for even less. Under the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1947, hundreds of Mustangs were transferred to Allied nations for the symbolic price of $1 each. Switzerland purchased 130 Mustangs in December 1947 for about $4,000 per aircraft and flew them until 1958, replacing pre-war fighters at bargain prices. The military believed the propeller fighter was finished. Jets were the future. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star had flown in 1944 and could outrun any piston-engine aircraft in level flight. Air forces around the world wanted jet fighters. The Mustang, it seemed, was destined for the scrapyard. Then, in the summer of 1950, history intervened. North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. Within days, Soviet-built tanks and overwhelming numbers pushed south across the 38th parallel. The South Korean military collapsed. American forces in Japan scrambled to respond, and almost immediately, commanders discovered a terrifying reality. Their jets were too fast. The Shooting Star burned fuel so quickly that pilots barely had time to identify targets before turning back. The round trip from Japan to Korea consumed most of their fuel. Over the battlefield, they had minutes, not hours. Worse still, early jets required long, paved runways. Korean airfields were short, rough, and cratered by artillery. Jet engines sucked in debris and flamed out. The most advanced fighters in the world were useless where ground troops needed help the most. The Mustang had none of these problems. It could loiter for hours. It could fly from dirt strips. It could carry bombs, rockets, and napalm. And there were hundreds of them, sitting in storage, waiting to be cut apart. The U.S. Air Force made a desperate decision. They brought the Mustang back from the dead. When the call came in the summer of 1950, the men who received it could hardly believe what they were being asked to do. The United States Air Force wanted P-51 Mustangs pulled out of storage, rebuilt, armed, and sent back into combat. 5 years earlier, these aircraft had been declared obsolete. Many had been sitting in desert boneyards, their engines drained, their tires rotting in the sun. Others had been handed to Air National Guard units as training aircraft, flown gently and rarely. Now, with American troops fighting for survival on the Korean peninsula, the Mustang was suddenly the most valuable airplane the Air Force owned. Crews worked around the clock. Dust was blown out of fuel lines. Merlin engines were coaxed back to life. Control cables were inspected, replaced, tensioned. Armor plating went back in. Hard points were refitted for bombs, rockets, and napalm. The aircraft's designation had changed. In June 1948, the newly independent U.S. Air Force had replaced the letter P for pursuit with F for fighter, but the airplane itself had not. The P-51 was now the F-51. In July 1950, 145 Mustangs were loaded onto the aircraft carrier USS Boxer at Alameda, California. It was an unprecedented move, fighters designed for land bases packed tightly onto a carrier deck, lashed down for a trans-Pacific sprint. The Boxer departed on July 14 and reached Yokosuka, Japan just 8 days and 7 hours later, setting a record for the fastest trans-Pacific crossing by an aircraft carrier. By the end of July, Mustangs were flying combat missions again. The fighter that had once escorted bombers over Berlin was now diving on North Korean tanks. In those early weeks, the situation on the ground was desperate. North Korean forces were pushing south with alarming speed. American and South Korean troops were retreating toward what would become the Pusan perimeter, fighting delaying actions against armor and mechanized infantry. Air support was often the only thing keeping units from being overrun. This was not the war the Mustang had been designed for. During World War II, the P-51 had been a high-altitude escort fighter, optimized to fly at 25,000 feet and above, where its supercharged Merlin engine could dominate the skies. Korea was different. The Mustang now flew low and slow, hunting trucks, tanks, bridges, and troop concentrations. It was dangerous, exhausting, and unforgiving work. One young pilot experienced that reality firsthand. Lieutenant E. Heath, barely out of flight training, had just over 200 hours in the Mustang when he found himself flying with the Republic of Korea Air Force. He was part of a small group of American pilots serving as advisors and combat leaders during the war's chaotic opening phase. On July 10, 1950, Heath was flying toward Suwon when his radio failed. Almost simultaneously, he spotted two North Korean tanks moving along a road below. Without a radio, he couldn't warn the rest of his flight. He had seconds to decide. He broke formation and attacked alone. He destroyed the first tank, then followed the road south. There he found 9 trucks and a half-track, all moving supplies toward the front. He strafed and destroyed them one by one. By the time he pulled away, his Mustang was nearly out of ammunition. Then he realized another problem. He was lost. Low on fuel, out of ammo, and flying without radio contact, Heath eventually managed to land at Haidong, only to find himself far behind friendly lines. It took him 5 days of walking and hitchhiking to make it back to his unit. That was the kind of war the Mustang was fighting in Korea. It was also the kind of war that exposed the Mustang's greatest weakness. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was a masterpiece of engineering, but it had a fatal flaw. Unlike aircraft such as the P-47 Thunderbolt or the Navy's F-4U Corsair, which used air-cooled radial engines, the Mustang's Merlin was liquid-cooled. A single rifle bullet through the radiator was often a death sentence. Coolant would leak out. The engine would overheat. Within minutes, it would seize. There was no limping home. No gliding to safety. Pilots had seconds to bail out or die with the aircraft. Ed Schmude, the brilliant engineer who had led the Mustang's design team at North American Aviation, watched the Korean War unfold with growing frustration. He later said the Mustang was never meant for ground attack. It was designed to fight at altitude, not to skim over hillsides at treetop level where every rifle, machine gun, and cannon could reach it. Flying Mustangs in close support, Schmude said, was almost suicidal. The Air Force had made a catastrophic decision after World War II. They had scrapped the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was heavier, slower, and less elegant than the Mustang, but it was built like a tank. Its radial engine could absorb tremendous damage and keep running. It was the perfect ground attack aircraft. The Navy had kept its Corsairs for the same reason. The Air Force had not. So the Mustang went to war. During the Korean War, 335 F-51 Mustangs were lost. 264 pilots were killed or went missing. Of those losses, 172 aircraft were brought down by enemy ground fire. Only 10 were shot down by enemy jet fighters. The rest were lost to accidents or simply disappeared. Winter made everything worse. Korean winters were brutal, bitter cold, heavy snow, and constant icing conditions. The Mustangs were not equipped with de-icing systems. Ice accumulated rapidly on wings and control surfaces, especially at low altitude. An overloaded aircraft that stalled or entered a spin almost never recovered. On the ground, conditions were just as grim. Pilots and mechanics lived in tents and unheated buildings. To stay warm, some airmen improvised heating systems using oil and 100-octane aviation fuel. Fires and explosions were common. Men who had survived combat were killed by accidents in their own camps. And yet, despite everything, the Mustang did its job. It stayed over the battlefield when jets had to leave. It operated from forward bases jets couldn't use. It reached targets jets couldn't reach. North Korean troops learned to fear the sound of the Merlin engine. They feared napalm most of all. pilots from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Squadron developed a brutal hybrid napalm mixture enhanced with thermite. It burned hot enough to melt the rubber off-tank road wheels, immobilizing vehicles and trapping crews inside. The psychological impact was devastating. North Korean forces began moving only at night, hiding vehicles under bridges, haystacks, and even inside houses to escape the Mustangs circling overhead. Allied air forces shared the burden. The Royal Australian Air Force's No. 77 Squadron flew Mustangs from July 1950 until April 1951, when they converted to jet aircraft. They suffered heavy losses but played a key role in halting the North Korean advance around Busan. Australian Mustangs also escorted American B-29 bombers on raids against enemy airfields. The South African Air Force's No. 2 Squadron flew Mustangs from November 1950 until transitioning to F-86 Sabres. They lost 12 pilots killed in action and 30 missing, earning a reputation for professionalism under relentless fire. For the South Koreans, the Mustang was not a temporary solution. It was their backbone. They could not afford jets. Many of their pilots were veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Services from World War II. They knew how to fly. They knew how to fight. They also knew the odds. By 1953, the Mustang was finally being replaced in American service by jet fighter bombers like the F-84 Thunderjet and F-86 Sabre. The last American F-51s were handed over to the South Korean Air Force in January of that year. The age of the propeller fighter in U.S. service was ending. But around the world, the Mustang's story was far from over. By the early 1950s, the P-51 Mustang had officially faded from the front lines of the world's most powerful air forces. Jets now ruled the skies of Europe, America, and the Soviet Union. Supersonic speed and radar-guided missiles were the future. But beyond the superpower spotlight, in regions fighting for survival, independence, or control, the Mustang was only just getting started. Its long range, reliability, and sheer toughness made it invaluable to smaller nations that could not afford jets, or did not need them. In these conflicts, the Mustang did not play the role of elegant high-altitude escort. It became something far more adaptable, a reconnaissance platform, a counterinsurgency aircraft, a strike fighter, and sometimes, something entirely new. In May 1948, the British Mandate of Palestine ended, and the State of Israel declared independence. Within hours, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded. Israel had almost no air force. What it did have was a handful of lightly armed civilian aircraft and a few Czechoslovak-built Ovia S-199s, temperamental machines so dangerous that Israeli pilots nicknamed them the Mule. Israel needed real fighters, fast. American surplus Mustangs were available, but there was a problem. The United States had imposed an arms embargo on the Middle East. Selling military aircraft was illegal. So the Israelis got creative. Under the direction of Ul Schwimmer, a New York-born engineer who would later found Israel Aerospace Industries, for P-51 Mustangs were quietly purchased in the United States. To bypass export restrictions, the crates were labeled as agricultural equipment, specifically, farm combines manufactured by International. No one questioned why a combine weighed 3 tons and came shaped like an airplane. The first 2 Mustangs arrived in September 1948. Mechanics assembled them at a hidden airstrip tucked among orange orchards near Herzliya. Within days, they were flying combat missions. The Mustang instantly became the best fighter Israel possessed. It was faster than Arab Spitfires. It had longer range than anything in the region. It could fly from improvised runways and strike targets across the Middle East, reaching Damascus or Cairo and returning on a single tank of fuel. On November 20, 1948, a British RAF de Havilland Mosquito was flying a reconnaissance mission over Israel. British aircraft had operated with near impunity, Israeli fighters couldn't reach them. That changed when Wayne Peake, an American volunteer pilot, scrambled in a Mustang. He climbed to altitude, intercepted the Mosquito, and shot it down. The message was unmistakable: the skies were no longer uncontested. On January 5, 1949, just 2 days before the final ceasefire, Israeli Mustangs escorted T-6 trainers pressed into ground attack roles. They encountered Egyptian fighters and shot down 3 in the ensuing dogfight, the Mustangs' last aerial victories of Israel's War of Independence. But its missions were far from over. By the mid-1950s, Israel was transitioning to jet aircraft, but the Mustang still had one unique advantage: range. In October 1956, Israel, Britain, and France secretly planned an attack on Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. As part of the plan, Israel struck first. Mustangs were pulled out of storage and reactivated. On October 29, 2 pairs of P-51s raced west across the Sinai Desert, flying so low their propellers nearly touched the sand. Their mission was unlike anything attempted before. They were going to cut telephone wires. Egyptian command and control relied heavily on landlines running through the desert. Radios were unreliable. If those lines were severed, Egyptian units would be isolated and confused. Engineers had designed a special device, a weighted cable dragged behind the aircraft to snag the wires. But when some of the devices failed, the pilots did not abort. They flew even lower. Using their wings and propeller blades, they sliced through the wires directly. It was almost suicidal. At that altitude, a single mistake meant instant death. The mission succeeded. Egyptian communications across the Sinai collapsed just as Israeli paratroopers dropped at Mitla Pass. Confusion spread through Egyptian units, contributing to Israel's rapid advance. The Mustang had become a wire cutter. Israel kept Mustangs in service until January 15, 1961, long after jets had taken over frontline roles elsewhere across the world. The Mustang found new homes. Sweden operated over 160 Mustangs, designated J-26, some modified for reconnaissance. In 1946 and 1947, Swedish Mustangs conducted secret mapping missions over Soviet military installations along the Baltic coast. The operation relied on the Mustang's ability to outdive any Soviet interceptor of the era. None were lost. The Philippines flew over 100 Mustangs against communist Huk insurgents in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The aircraft also became the first mount of the Philippine Air Force's aerobatic team, the Blue Diamonds. Indonesia used Mustangs during multiple internal conflicts in the 1950s. On May 18, 1958, an Indonesian P-51 shot down a CIA-flown B-26 invader during the Permesta Rebellion, the only confirmed air-to-air victory in Indonesian Air Force history. Guatemala, Haiti, and several Central American nations kept Mustangs flying well into the 1970s. But the most remarkable Mustang operator of all was a small Caribbean nation few expected. The Dominican Air Force received its first Mustangs in 1948. Brazilian mercenary pilots, World War II veterans, trained over 100 Dominican aviators. More aircraft followed, including 32 ex-Swedish F-51DS purchased in the early 1950s. For decades, the Mustang was the backbone of Dominican air power. They were among the most visually striking fighters in the world, painted in bold colors, adorned with shark mouth nose art that made them look like aerial predators. They flew during the 1959 Constanza invasion, the 1965 Dominican Civil War, and even during the American intervention known as Operation Power Pack. One Mustang was shot down during that intervention. It was the last Mustang ever destroyed in combat. Yet the Dominicans kept flying them. When their early jets wore out in the 1970s and were not replaced, the Mustangs became the country's only armed fighters. In 1983, when a Cuban intelligence ship refused to leave Dominican waters, Mustangs were scrambled and strafed the vessel until it departed. Cuban MiG-21s later buzzed Dominican air bases in response. Mustang pilots wisely stayed on the ground. The humiliation led to U.S. assistance and the introduction of F-37 Dragonfly jets. The Dominican Republic finally retired its Mustangs in 1984. 40 years after their introduction. They were the last operational combat Mustangs in the world. But before the Mustang's combat career truly ended, it would fight one final war, a war that would go down in aviation history as the last conflict between propeller-driven fighters. By the summer of 1969, the world had moved on. American astronauts were preparing to walk on the moon. In Vietnam, jet fighters screamed over the jungle at supersonic speed, firing radar-guided missiles at distant targets. To most people, the propeller-driven fighter belonged to museums and history books. But in Central America, time had not moved so quickly. Two small nations, El Salvador and Honduras, had been drifting toward war for years. Land disputes, immigration tensions, and political instability had created a powder keg. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans had migrated to Honduras for work. Honduran land reforms forced many of them out, inflaming resentment on both sides. The spark came from football. During the 1970 World Cup qualifiers in June 1969, riots erupted after matches between the two countries. Violence spilled into the streets. After El Salvador won the deciding match on June 26, diplomatic relations were severed. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador invaded Honduras. What followed would become known as the Football War, and it would make aviation history. Prop against prop, the last of its kind. Both air forces were relics of another era. Honduras flew F-4U Corsairs, the bent-wing naval fighters of World War II, armed with 20mm cannons. El Salvador operated Corsairs as well, but also something more unusual, Cavalier Mustang IS, modernized P-51s rebuilt in the United States with improved engines, updated avionics, and wingtip fuel tanks for extended range. These were not museum pieces. They were combat aircraft. The war began clumsily. On the evening of July 14, a Salvadoran CA-47 transport, never designed as a bomber, flew over a Honduran air base. Crewmen rolled 100-pound bombs out the cargo door by hand. They missed everything. But the fighting escalated quickly. Mustangs and Corsairs flew ground attack missions, strafing roads, bridges, and troop concentrations with rockets, napalm, and machine gun fire. Then, on July 17, aviation history reached its final chapter. Fernando Soto's Day. Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force took off on his fourth mission of the day, flying an F-4U-5 Corsair. His task was close air support. As his flight approached the combat zone, Soto ordered a weapons check. One of his wingmen, Captain Zapida, reported a critical problem: his cannons had jammed. Soto ordered him to return to base. As Zapida flew alone, two Salvadoran Cavalier Mustangs spotted him. They dove into attack. Zapida fought desperately, throwing his Corsair into violent evasive maneuvers, calling for help over the radio. Soto heard him. He and his remaining wingmen jettisoned their bombs and dove back toward the fight. One of the Mustang pilots, Captain Douglas Varela, lined up for a kill. He fired, but missed. As he repositioned, Soto came down behind him. The Corsair's 20mm cannons opened fire. The Mustang disintegrated and went down. The second Mustang pilot, Lionel Lovo, tried to escape. Soto chased him down and destroyed him as well. Two Mustangs. Minutes apart. Soto was not finished. Continuing toward his original target area, he encountered two Salvadoran Corsairs returning from a mission. He engaged and shot down both of them. In a single day, Fernando Soto scored 3 confirmed aerial victories, 1 Mustang and 2 Corsairs. They were the last confirmed kills ever made in combat between propeller-driven fighters. Soto's aircraft, F-4U-5 Corsair No. 609, is preserved today in the Honduran Air Museum, with 3 kill markings painted beneath the cockpit. The war ended the next day, brokered by the Organization of American States. It had lasted just 100 hours, but more than 3,000 people were dead and tens of thousands displaced. And with it, the combat career of the P-51 Mustang finally came to an end. Or so it seemed. Saving the Mustang. Remember Ed Maloney, the teenager who had watched Mustangs being cut apart in 1945? He never forgot. Over the years, Maloney worked odd jobs, scraped together money, and began buying surplus aircraft, sometimes trading one for another. On January 12, 1957, he opened his collection to the public. It became the first aviation museum west of the Rocky Mountains. Eventually, that collection found a permanent home at Chino Airport, California, the same place where Maloney had once watched warplanes destroyed. The museum became known as Planes of Fame. Maloney was not alone. Across the United States and around the world, former pilots and mechanics began rescuing Mustangs from scrapyards, foreign air forces, and crash sites. They learned to maintain Merlin engines long after Rolls-Royce had stopped building them. Restoration shops appeared in America, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. A Warbird movement was born. In the 1960s, a flyable Mustang might sell for $30,000. By the 1980s, prices exceeded $100,000. Today, an airworthy P-51 typically sells for $2 to $4 million, with historically significant examples exceeding $5 million. There are now more than 160 airworthy Mustangs worldwide, over 200 registered in the United States alone. And most of them still fly. Back to speed, Reno and beyond. The Mustang also reclaimed its place in the sky through air racing. In 1964, businessman and showman Bill Stead revived air racing in the Nevada desert near Reno, far from residential neighborhoods. The Reno air races were born. Mustangs came out of storage. Pilots who had kept their Warbirds alive through lean decades finally had a reason to fly them again. A new generation, too young to have fought in World War II, discovered the thrill of racing the same aircraft their fathers had flown into combat. Names like Voodoo, Striga, and Red Baron became legends. Modern racing Mustangs produce over 3,000 horsepower, nearly double their wartime output. Some exceed 450 miles per hour, faster than the aircraft ever flew in combat. They have clipped wings, stretched fuselages, and radically modified cooling systems. 80 years later, the Mustang's performance envelope is still being explored. The Mustang today. The P-51 Mustang appears at airshows from Oshkosh to Wanaka. It stars in films. Tom Cruise owns one and flew it himself in Top Gun: Maverick. Many restored aircraft wear the exact markings of wartime fighters, the red-tailed Mustangs of the Tuskegee Airmen, the red-nosed fighters of the 4th Fighter Group, the blue-striped aircraft of the 357th. Inside, restorers balance authenticity with safety, reinstalling armor and deactivated machine guns alongside modern avionics. One aircraft, Sierra Sioux 2, is considered the most original flying P-51D in existence. Restored over 3 years, nearly every component dates back to its 1944 construction. In 2015, it won top honors at Oshkosh. In 2013, a Mustang named the Rebel climbed to 42,568 feet, setting a world altitude record for piston-engine aircraft, nearly 70 years after the type first flew. Why the Mustang endures? The P-51 Mustang was designed in 102 days in 1940 as a stopgap solution. It was never meant to last this long. Yet it became the defining American fighter of World War II. Then a ground attack aircraft in Korea. A wire cutter in the Sinai. A counterinsurgency fighter across the developing world. A racer, a museum piece, a living machine. Factories closed in 1945. But the sound of that Merlin engine still fills the sky. Machines are not supposed to outlive their purpose by 8 decades. The Mustang did, because people refused to let it die. And that is what happened to the P-51 Mustang after World War II.